Niall Ferguson joining us. Lawrence A. Tisch, Professor of History at Harvard University, Hoover Institute Senior Fellow. Good to see you, Neil.
Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. What's your take on all of these headlines first in the global economy? You're traveling the world, speaking to so many people. How do you see the world right now?
Let's take a step back because we're all focused on the short run, but let's think of this as just sequential. There was a U.S. crisis in 2008-2009 that had its origins in the mortgage market. That was more or less dealt with by the Fed, and then there was a Eurozone crisis which blew up somewhat later, and that got more or less dealt with by the ECB. Guess what? Now we have a Chinese crisis which is spilling right the way through the global economy. I mean, it's not just about the growth number, which in any case we probably shouldn't believe. It's really much more about capital flight. The Chinese are pessimistic about China. There's massive outflows. There's a great wall of money trying to get out of China, and that brings with it the risk of a significant depreciation of the Chinese currency. That's put the frighteners on other emerging markets. There's a risk of an Asian currency war, and of course all commodities, including oil, have felt the pain from a Chinese slowdown. So that's really what I think we're seeing, the third of a sequence of crises going back to 2008.
And of course, we look at the Chinese yuan being devalued because it makes the products coming out of China that much cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, what's driving this is not so much trying to be competitive in export markets. I mean, they'd love to be less reliant on exports. That's part of the transition they're trying to achieve. But I think the key issue here is that the Chinese have been talking for some time now about having a liberalized capital account and a convertible currency and making the renminbi, the Chinese currency, a kind of competitor with, junior partner to the dollar. Well, that's all very well, but if money wants to get out of China and you can't stop it because you're liberalizing the capital account, well, the exchange rate is going to slide. And they've been trying since August to stop that, to slow down the slide by massive intervention. I think at some point that's going to crack and we're going to see a further depreciation of the Chinese currency. Might not be quite yet. Coming up to Chinese New Year, there's going to be a lull really, but I was looking ahead to the spring, you could see further action there. So I think that's part of the story. And the other part, I think, is the effect, the ripple-through effect of the Chinese slowdown on commodity prices, especially oil.
And of course, the commodities complex hasn't completely collapsed, not just oil, but iron ore, steel, and all those things used to make houses. But it does feel like there's such an aggressive reaction in global markets. I guess it's hard to figure out what global markets are thinking when you put it in context.
Well, a lot of these commodity countries, think of the big oil exporters, are actually liquidating assets in U.S. markets right now. I mean, they're running enormous deficits. Just take Saudi Arabia, the deficit's about 25% of GDP. Their budgets depend on expensive oil. Right now, they've got oil back down in the $20 to $30 range. And that's creating huge fiscal holes for these commodity exporters. And that's why you're seeing sell-offs. I think part of what we're seeing is outflows of money by distressed sellers in the commodity countries.
Meanwhile, in the face of all of this, you've also got this situation on geopolitics front. So the Middle East, how do you characterize things right now? You've got this new upset between the Saudis and the Iranians, where the Saudis have cut all diplomatic ties with Iran, and several other countries are following the Saudis' lead.
Well, I can't say I'm surprised by this. When the so-called Arab Spring began, I remember we were here at Davos. I said, this is not some wonderful news. This is going to lead to an escalating crisis, and in particular, Islamists will be the beneficiaries of the collapse of authoritarian regimes. Conflict has escalated steadily, almost exponentially, in fact, since those revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and later Libya and Syria. And some of these countries, including Libya and Syria, have collapsed into civil war. This ain't over. We're ultimately on the road to a kind of massive region-wide sectarian battle for power in a post-American Middle East. Remember, the President Obama, announced effectively that the U.S. was no longer the global policeman, was no longer going to be hegemonic in the Middle East. The race is therefore on for power if the U.S. is no longer the dominant player in the region. And that is a race between Iran and Saudi Arabia, principally, between Shia and Sunni. And it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, I'm afraid.
What should the U.S. be doing right now? A real debate in terms of the U.S.'s position within the Middle East, as you have ISIS getting stronger and you have the upset and other terrorists getting stronger. What should the U.S. be doing?
The next president is going to have to review and probably reverse the policy of the Obama administration, because that policy has been to gamble on a relationship with Iran that I think is ultimately going to be a deep disappointment. Sanctions have been lifted. The Iranians are now able to sell oil, by the way, another reason why oil should be heading down. And it's not at all clear to me that the US is going to get the payoff in terms of some kind of more liberal Iranian regime. On the contrary, hardliners still seem to have a lot of power in the country, and some of that money from sanctions relief is going to go straight into the sectarian battles that we see being waged as far afield as Syria and Yemen. So I think the next president is going to have to say, was this a huge wrong turning? Don't we need to really put our support into traditional allies in the region, like Israel, like Egypt? I mean, after all, since 2011, maybe even since 2009 and his Cairo speech, President Obama has essentially switched sides in the Middle East, moved away from traditional allies and got closer and closer to Iran, which since 1979 has been really the United States' principal antagonist in the region. I think this is going to turn out to have been a major wrong turning, and the next president, whoever the next president is going to have to change it.
It is a head-scratcher when you consider all of this, while we know that Iran has been, in fact, the biggest supporter of terrorism.
Well, the president tried to explain himself in an interview in 2014 where he said he wanted an equilibrium between Sunni and Shiite powers, in effect between Saudis and Iranians. And I said at the time, he's not going to get an equilibrium, he's going to get a major war, because you don't necessarily get the balance of power. In a situation like that, you may get escalating conflict. And I'm very much afraid that the Iran deal on nuclear arms ultimately set a timeline for a showdown between Sunni and Shiite powers, because by 8 years' time, the Iranians will be on the point of being a nuclear armed power. So the race is on to make sure that they don't become the dominant power in the region. And that's, I think, where the president made a fundamental strategic mistake.
And of course, the Saudis have already said, if they have one, we want one.
Exactly. So you have an arms race at all levels, from the local terrorist level all the way up to nuclear power.